like true. First rule of Fight Club is... What do you talk? Say hello to my little friend!
Burrard Inlet has long been the ancestral home of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. In the mid-1800s, Europeans built industries along our shores. To supplement our traditional economies, we started working for wages. In 1886, First Nations made up the majority of the workforce in British Columbia. One of the jobs we excelled at was longshoring, working on the docks and loading ships. Indian gangs, as they were known, gained a reputation for efficiency and speed. One man who started working with the gangs in the late 1800s was William Nahaney.
Nahaney was one of the head guys. They were the greatest men that ever worked lumber.
Even though Indian gangs could load lumber faster than other crews, they still faced discrimination. Other unions shut them out, regarding them as inferior, and yet a threat to white jobs. Nahaney and his crew responded by creating a union of their own, nicknamed the Bows and Arrows. It was a local of the industrial workers of the world.
We had Chileans, Spanish, a few Swedes, English, and Mexicans. They were all nationalities.
Part of the IWW's appeal for the Bows and Arrows was its focus on racial solidarity meeting discrimination with collective power. The Bows and Arrows showed that workers from many cultures could use unions to fight for equality. As for William Nahaney, after 50 years as a longshoreman, he was still called the best on the docks.
In 1911, construction began on the Canadian Northern Railway along the Fraser River. While the setting was spectacular, camps for the 8,000 workers were not.
The air became so foul at night it was not uncommon for the men to arise in the morning too sick to work. Along the Fraser River, human life is held in contempt by the contractors.
One of the owners of Canadian Northern, William Mackenzie, was a celebrated entrepreneur and a knight of the British realm. He was also accused of pocketing government funds before they got to the workers, adding to the misery of life in the camps. Organizers from the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, arrived in the Fraser Canyon to help workers fight for better conditions. Despite the union's efforts and a provincial health act, living conditions in the camps got worse. On March 27, 1912, workers from Hope to Kamloops walked off the job. The Fraser River strike gained support from international IWW organizers who extended picket lines to cities throughout North America in order to prevent the hiring of scab labor. Support from the IWW helped maintain morale in the camps.
Where the Fraser River flows, each fellow worker knows they have bullied and oppressed us, but still our union grows.
But Sir William Mackenzie fought back. He used his influence with the provincial government to bring in police. Strike camps were burnt down, and more than 250 men were arrested. Although this strike ended unsuccessfully, the IWW trained local organizers who would lead the major labor battles to come in the 1930s. And more importantly, it showed that unskilled workers from different ethnic backgrounds could successfully organize.
Shorter hours and better pay, boys. We're going to win the day, boys, where the River Fraser flows.
In the early 1900s, nursing was regarded as a kind of domestic duty for hospitals. Nursing schools at the time provided cheap, unskilled labor, and nurses were not given the training nor the recognition offered skilled professionals. In 1919, at the Vancouver General Hospital, these attitudes were finally challenged by Ethel Johns, the first director of nursing. Johns knew that professional recognition would only come by improving education. In the early 1920s, she headed up the 5-year degree program at the University of British Columbia. This program was met with resistance from physicians.
Nurses have foolishly raised their status so they've almost become a menace to the practice of medicine.
But Ethel Johns held her ground.
These doctors require 2 types of nurses, a highly specialized type and a routine worker. The trouble is, they insist that the same nurse become both.
To address this dilemma, Johns introduced the idea of nurse aides, a concept that wasn't embraced at Vancouver General until the 1940s. As education continued to improve, nurses in BC led the way on other labor issues. In 1947, nurses at Vancouver General negotiated a minimum wage agreement. It was the beginning of continual improvements in hours and wages and helped define the professional nurse.
In 1910, Albert Goodwin, a young man from England, arrived on Vancouver Island. He found work as a miner and soon saw firsthand how dangerous mines were. The disregard for miners' safety radicalized him. After the strike of 1912, also known as the Vancouver Island War, as a member of the Socialist Party of Canada, Goodwin spoke out about the appalling conditions. For this, he was blacklisted and was never again allowed to mine coal. Goodwin moved on to Trail in the BC interior, where by 1916 he was working at the smelter. Recognized for his stand on workers' rights, Goodwin became vice president of the BC Federation of Labor and head of the Trail Labor Council. He also spoke out against World War I.
War is simply a part of the process of capitalism. Big financial interests are playing the game. They'll reap the victory no matter how the war ends.
In 1917, Goodwin led smelter workers on strike in support of an 8-hour workday. Goodwin had been exempted from military service due to black lung from working in the mines. But after the strike, he was declared fit for duty. Rather than fight a war he didn't believe in, Goodwin fled Trail. Hunted by police for dodging the draft, he hid out at Comox Lake on Vancouver Island. On July 27, 1918, he was tracked down by Constable Dan Campbell. Goodwin was shot dead. Campbell claimed self-defense. Goodwin's friends cried murder. In protest, miners on the island stopped work. In Vancouver, workers across the city downed their tools. It was August 2nd, 1918. The death of a single union worker, Ginger Goodwin, had led to Canada's first general strike. In Cumberland, during Goodwin's funeral, a procession a mile long filled the street. They had gathered to bid farewell to one of their own, a labor man who gave his life for the basic right to organize. Like many professional photographers of the 1930s, Wilmer Gold often sold his images back to the people in his photos. But Wilmer had chosen a particularly challenging subject to capture: the people of the logging industry on Vancouver Island. To take his photographs meant traveling through miles of bush with bulky, fragile equipment, and then later, making the trek back again with the finished photos. Eventually, Wilmer created a traveling darkroom which he towed behind his car. His work appeared in Time, Life, Look, and Maclean's magazines, and became one of the largest photographic collections depicting the workers of British Columbia's logging industry. In the early 1930s, during the depths of the Great Depression, 1 in 4 Canadians was out of work. The federal government's response to this was to create work relief camps in rural areas across Canada. These camps were run by the Department of Defense and offered back-breaking labor in exchange for 20 cents a day. The men called them slave camps. In the spring of 1935, union activists, including a communist activist, Arthur Evans, organized a series of strikes demanding real work and decent wages. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett, whose conservative government was responsible for relief, ignored their demands. In response, the strikers left the camps and descended on Vancouver to make their complaints heard. The BC government refused responsibility for the strikers' welfare. On June 3, 1935, over 1,000 men jumped an eastbound freight train to take their demands directly to Ottawa. As trekkers headed east, other unemployed workers joined them. By the time they had reached Regina, they were 2,000 strong. The Prime Minister feared these protesters would ignite a communist revolt, and he moved to stop them. Bennett barred the trekkers' access to the railways, effectively holding them in Regina. He then invited a delegation of their leaders, headed by Arthur Evans, to meet with him in Ottawa. The meeting didn't go so well. The words embezzler, liar, and fraud were thrown about in loud voices. Evans and the other delegates went back to Regina. Having failed to achieve their goals, the protesters prepared to disband. But the RCMP refused to let them leave. The police had plans to send all the trekkers to a camp north of the city. At 2 p.m. on July 1st, 1935, Evans and his delegation held a public meeting. The crowd gathered, consisting mostly of local townfolk. Many of the trekkers were on the other side of town watching a ball game. All were unaware that Bennett had brought in the mounted police. Without warning, the police rushed the unsuspecting crowd.
They didn't give people a chance to disperse. They just clubbed and tear-gassed. It was brutal.
When the attack was over, more than 120 were arrested. A striker and an undercover police officer were dead. Great damage was also done to Bennett's reputation of law, order, and good government. 3 months later, Bennett was out of office. And within a year, the relief camps were shut down.
One day in 1939, 40 school teachers asked the Langley School Board for a raise. In those days, teachers' salaries were set by the school board. The Langley School Board, made up of pillars of the Langley community and chaired by local landowner J.W. Barry, said no. So the teachers, led by Connie Jervis, the 24-year-old president of the Langley Teachers Association, took their dispute to an arbitration hearing. The school board refused to attend the hearing, and so Jervis and her fellow teachers won. Still, the Langley board refused to give them their raise, so the teachers sued in court and won again. This time, the school board fired 14 of the teachers, including Jervis.
The trustees of this board advise you that your resignation from the teaching staff is requested.
Jervis then appealed to the Department of Education and won.
The department has reversed the action of the Langley School Board. You may return to work if you so desire.
J.W. Barrie reassigned Jervis and 4 other teachers to a remote school, one difficult to reach without a car. Jervis and her fellow teachers responded with a sit-in and launched an appeal.
The board has noted with some surprise that you intend to appeal your transfer.
Barrie once again ordered Jervis to a remote school. By this time, the Department of Education had had enough, and Barrie and his complete board were ousted. Jervis and the other teachers were reinstated at Murrayville, and all were paid an increase in salary. After Langley, compulsory arbitration for teachers was never again challenged. The courage of Connie Jervis helped entrench her legal rights and win an important victory for teachers throughout BC.
In the late 1930s, workers in Canada had lived through years of crushing unemployment with little help from government. In BC, the closure of work relief camps had left thousands homeless and unemployed. In 1938, they gathered in Vancouver wanting either work or relief. Among them, 26-year-old organizer Steve Brody decided to pressure the government into improving conditions for the unemployed. On May 20th, he gathered 1,200 men in East Vancouver and marched downtown. As planned, the men occupied 3 buildings: the Art Gallery, the Post Office, and the Hotel Georgia. It was a non-violent protest. In fact, the protesters at the hotel left after being paid $500, but the men held fast at the other 2 locations. The protesters even offered to be arrested peacefully. Chief Constable Foster refused.
All right, guys, you made your point. It's time you went home.
Leader Steve Brody pointed out,
If we had homes, we'd be in them. You're going to have to arrest us.
but the local constable didn't want 1,000 men filling his jails and clogging the courts, so it turned into a standoff. After a month, the federal government lost patience. On June 9, 1938, shortly after 5 a.m., on Father's Day, the RCMP flooded the post office with tear gas. Then they entered and forcibly ejected the occupiers, brutally beating them. Organizer Steve Brody was beaten unconscious. Word of how the police had mishandled the eviction spread quickly. Nearly 15,000 outraged Vancouverites filled Oppenheimer Park to protest police brutality. People from all walks of life came to show their support. Public opinion had shifted to sympathy with the protesters. There wasn't another clash between police and the unemployed for the rest of the Great Depression.